Yes. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our technically second session of our delivery lifecycle, development lifecycle and deployment. I always forget the name of the certificate. Our study series all about delivery, development, and deployment. So this is the first one where we're going to start going deep dive into different topics. And the first one I wanted to talk about was delivery teams. We'll start by just a little bit of an introduction. Who are Ladies Be Architects? We are the co-leaders of the group, founded by Gemma. You can see here in the middle. We've got Adrian, Charlie, Susanna, Vicky, and myself. But we also, all of you, anyone who gets involved and comes along to the sessions, that's just who we are, I guess. Anything you wanted to add to that, Vicky?
No, that's all good.
Cool. And so here's me. I'm Emily McCowan. I'm a solution architect at Maverick. And that leads me into one of the things I wanted to say. A big thank you to our new sponsor, who is Maverick. Oh, I've jumped ahead a little bit. Maverick have kindly agreed to sponsor us this financial year. So that's really helpful. That helps us keep running. It's helped with our migration to our new website, which you can all check out at ladiesbearchitects.com. That's where we keep our blog and links to other handy resources to help you while you're studying on your architect journey. And we also post all of our previous sessions and registration forms there too. So thanks, Maverick. And yeah, the agenda today. So I'm going to start by talking about who and I guess what kind of subcommittees and groups form a delivery team, and importantly, what are the roles and responsibilities? Because I know that probably all of us have experienced this before. You may play different roles on different projects. You may have a job title of an architect or a functional analyst or a delivery lead, but you find yourself doing all sorts of different responsibilities. So I wanted to talk about what are the key roles and responsibilities to keep in mind when you're putting together a delivery team. Also about where and when. So this is the physical where and when, but also, what tools are people working in, what milestones and things are, I guess, reached as part of the delivery life cycle, and how the team works together. So the ways of working, what you actually do, and then making sure that people are invested in those, that they have a say, they buy into it, and that's really important to the success of any kind of DevOps approach. And what we need from you is participate. So don't be shy to ask questions. We've got some more interactive polls that we'll be doing on Slido today. We'd love to hear about your thoughts and your experiences. We're open to everyone attending, so invite your friends. Everyone's welcome. And we're also always keen to hear about other women who are interested in leading a study session. So please don't be shy. Reach out to Vicky or myself, and we'll chat to you about what that would look like. And we're all at different stages. Some of us are on the journey to CTA. Some of us are just trying to be the best architects that we can be. For some of us, that means certifications. For others, that just means experience and knowledge sharing. But no matter where we are, even the certified technical architects don't know everything. So we might sometimes get it wrong. Please let us know if you notice anything. And Hayley, you've asked a question about why the sunflowers. Honestly, I don't know. I might ask Gemma. I think it's just because she likes sunflowers.
Yeah, I don't know either. It was a good question.
It's a nice little motif, bright and cheerful. Okay. So let's dive into the who and what. We're going to start with a Slido. So let me just get this one started. While you go onto your phone or your browser tab, go to slido.com and enter in the code. I want to know what you think the key roles and responsibilities in a delivery team are. Where is my slide? Here it is. And I'll present this in a new tab. So we can all see what people are dropping in. Awesome. Yes, executive sponsor is super important. You've got to have someone who is driving the whole initiative, and the business analyst is really important. Architects, obviously, yes. We would naturally think they're very important on a project. Some other ideas, yep, developers, you need people who are going to build. Release managers, yes, you need to make sure someone's managing those environments, the deployments, someone who's making sure that the DevOps lifecycle is working effectively. There's also QA, people who are testing, that's really important. Delivery leads, that kind of thing. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the lens that we're going to have for this particular session, because there are a lot of people at a lot of different layers of a delivery team, or the entire governance model that surrounds a project or an initiative. So there's, I think, 3 kind of levels that we could look at it at. There's the overall governance model. That's the wider structure where a project or an org might sit in an organization. There's a center of excellence, which is a little bit more of a narrow focus, again, which are all the stakeholders and teams that need to be involved in the say-so of what happens on an org and for a project. And then there's the next level down, which is really where we're focusing today, on the delivery team. I will, though, start by setting the kind of scene for what the overall governance model is and where the delivery team sits within that, so that we've got a bit of a reference. In a future session, we're actually going to go deeper into overall governance and those kind of leadership roles that sit around a project. So this is from the wonderful Salesforce Architects resource. They have a Center of Excellence operating model. This is pretty detailed, so I've annotated it a little bit to make it a bit more clear about who sits where. So we've got the executive steering committee that's usually going to include the project sponsor, that executive sponsor that someone mentions, other executives who have influence over the budget or the strategy that's going to be driving what happens in a project. The program management office usually has a representation here, and definitely the project manager would be attending. They're the ones feeding the information up and then back down. You have the Center of Excellence that's really bringing together all the different areas of the business, from the actual, operational side and the technical, like IT side of the business, and the delivery team sits within that. So you have business stakeholders and SMEs providing advice into the Center of Excellence. They're providing maybe frameworks, authorizations for use of data, that kind of thing. You also have information technology providing the same sorts of frameworks and authorizations, but from a different perspective. Here's the way that we handle integration in our enterprise landscape, that kind of thing. And potentially secondments from both business and IT. You may have a business analyst who is kind of a pro in one particular team, and they come into your Center of Excellence while you're developing out an org, because the area of the business that you're impacting needs that strong representation. So zooming in a little bit to the Center of Excellence, and I won't go into massive detail here, but here are some of the key, I guess, roles and teams in a Center of Excellence. But I just wanted to mostly highlight that the delivery team sits right in the middle of that. And you may have multiple delivery teams. Maybe you're working in a multi-org scenario. Maybe you have a delivery team that's focused on Salesforce and another one that's focused on the corporate website. Or maybe you have a really, really big org and you have a delivery team that's focused on the Sales Cloud features versus one focused more on Service Cloud. There are a lot of different ways you can break that up. So let's zoom in again to our focus for this session is the delivery team. Now, for the next few slides, what I've put together is my view of what are the different areas, I guess, of responsibility or roles in a delivery team and drilling in a bit into each of those. But I'm keen to hear what you think. So we'll do another Slido at the end. So if you think there's anything I've missed, if there's anything you would word differently or want to add, note that down, keep that in mind. So these are the, I guess, 6 that I think are the main components of what a successful delivery team looks like. You need to have strong project leadership. We have a strong business analysis component. Change management is really key. Obviously, we need someone to actually do the development, and then testing that with quality assurance to make sure it's acceptable and it's working as expected. And then, of course, the DevOps area to make sure that all of those developments and releases are happening smoothly. So let's zoom into project leadership first. These are the things that I think project leadership are responsible for. Now, it can be definitely the case that you have someone who's acting in a lead or senior developer role, and you might think that they would sit in the development area of this kind of brainstorm, but they'll have responsibilities within project leadership as well. So someone could have a role in a project that pulls responsibilities from lots of different areas. Project leadership, to my mind, they're responsible for making sure that meetings, and if you're using an agile framework, important ceremonies are happening and that they're facilitated. They're reporting and tracking on the progress of the project. They're providing guidance to the team. So that might be overall guidance on what's the strategy, what's the timeline, what are our priorities, or it could be guidance on how technically are we going to build this. Maybe it's a feature that's relatively new to the developers on the team, so we have an architect who is able to provide that kind of technical leadership to the team. Documentation, this is going to be a theme throughout. I think everyone's role has a responsibility to be documenting something or other. In project leadership, it'd be things like the framework of the project. What is the scope? What is the overall solution architecture design? That kind of thing. Project leadership is responsible for managing business relationships. So making sure that we've got the right I guess, championing from leaders in the business and that the business understands what we're trying to do. That also has a bit of a crossover with the change management and business analysis components. It's on project leadership to ensure adequate resourcing, and I'm using that in terms of funding and time, but also adequate people on a project. So do we have the right skill sets represented? Do we need more people? Obviously responsible for architecture, so there'll be an architect, hopefully, or someone who's performing architect responsibilities on a project, who's responsible for making sure the overall architecture is scalable, it's stable, resilient, it's something that's going to be accepted by the business. And then finally, I think project leadership is responsible for escalation. So they are escalated to, but they are also the ones who escalate further up the chain into the PMO or the steerco if something's potentially going to be a problem or already is a problem.
Sorry, I missed David's question here. You mentioned secondment a couple of slides back. So what's
Yes.
a secondment?
Secondment is like my job and my boss is in a particular area of the business, but for maybe 6 months, I'm going to go actually report into a different team while this project is happening. So an example might be you're implementing Sales Cloud, and you may have like a sales or a RevOps person in the sales team reporting to the head of sales for the business. But that RevOps analyst might come into your center of excellence or even into your delivery team as a business analyst to make sure that they're able to use their connections and their knowledge of that particular department to get the right requirements and buy-in and that kind of thing. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, it's just not something I've ever heard in America.
Yeah, cool. There must be an Australian or a UK-ism. Cool. All right. So let's talk a little bit about business analysis now. So planning and facilitating workshops. It's about gathering requirements, but it's not just requirements. So we've got requirement elicitation, but those workshops could be requirement gathering. It could be playbacks, that kind of thing. So business analysts often are the ones who are helping to work with the architect, or maybe they're performing this particular architect responsibility of putting together the plan for what workshops need to happen, and making sure the right people are there and it's in the right kind of format, we've got the right amount of time, and that it's going to be documented properly. So documentation is obviously a key business analysis responsibility. Documentation of things like use cases, user stories, acceptance criteria, that kind of thing. DevOps is another obviously key role, and one of the things that we're focusing a lot in this whole study series. So someone who's got DevOps responsibilities may be overseeing things like the ways of working in a team, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this session. Release management, as well as environment management and branching. So what different environments are we working with? That could be scratch orgs, sandboxes. It could be different applications as well. It's not just about Salesforce. And how are we managing the way metadata and data moves between all of those environments and branches? What are the kind of checkpoints that we have before things need to move, whether it's like pull requests, if it's part of the actual development, or into production? Do we have to go through like a change review process to make sure that the deployment is accepted and we have a rollback plan and that kind of thing? They're probably going to have some responsibility for documenting all of that. One of the things that I think is really good to do when you have a project is to get together at the outset and put this kind of plan together, but then to revisit it as you're going to see what's working and what's not, and update it as you go. And that's really helpful if you have people who join partway through. Usually happens because projects can go for a while. And if someone joins halfway through and has no idea what sandboxes you're using or what branching strategy you've got, it can be really confusing and slow them down, make them less effective. And then tooling. So the DevOps responsibility usually about managing what kind of tooling you have and that it's all hooked up and working correctly. So what are you using for your version control, like Bitbucket, GitHub, that kind of thing? What approach are you using for your CI and CD? So are you using something more declarative like gear set, or do you have a strong kind of development, like, you know, classic programmatic development contingent in your team? So you're more using VS Code, VS Code and Jenkins or Azure pipelines or something like that. And are those all integrated to the right environments? Are they working when they should be? Is it kicking off any automated testing that it should, that kind of thing? Change management. So I confess, I know a bit about change management, but I'm certainly not a pro. I know that change management is responsible for overall stakeholder engagement, making sure that people understand what the whole purpose of the project or the initiative is, and that they're, I guess they're familiar, they understand why, and helping them to get that adoption ultimately of when it's released. They will be creating and documenting a communications plan with the business or with external stakeholders, and then making sure that's executed. And they're also generally, under this bucket falls training responsibilities, although it's usually not the same people overseeing the overall change management plan and actually delivering the training. That training could be, train the trainer, where you're kind of handing over to trainers or to admins. It could be actual end user training, things like training needs analyses, that kind of thing, falls in change management. Development. So obviously they're the people who are configuring or coding the solution. They're actually doing the builds. They're writing test classes. They're documenting what they're doing. And there's lots of different ways that you could be documenting this. Some people just use the branch to be kind of self-documenting of what what was built for that particular feature via the Jira story. Some people will have like a configuration workbook kind of thing that gets added to as you go to record what has been built overall for the project. I like to make sure that there's a as-built technical guide at the end of every project that I'm involved in. And one of the things that kind of helps me make sure that that can be done and done well is to iterate on that on a like sprint by sprint basis. So picking up from the developers, what did you build? How did you build it? And make sure that that's documented in a way that someone coming after the fact is able to understand and support the system. Development can be, the people doing the do, but also the senior development. So I've got PRs being pull requests. That could be someone who's submitting PRs or someone who's reviewing PRs. So making sure that you're kind of checking each other's work, that people are aligning with the best practices for whatever kind of build tool you're using. So, there's kind of rules that go across different tools like Flow and Code about not doing DMLs, pardon me, not doing DMLs within loops. So you're not actually updating or creating records in a loop and then resulting in hitting your governor limits. But there's specific things to each tool that you're using about like what the appropriate use is, if that makes sense. The way that you would potentially like configure an integration between Salesforce and an external application that has a pre-built connector versus Salesforce and an application that maybe doesn't have a connector, and are you using middleware? Your use of like which authentication and authorization approach, that kind of thing will differ, and it's up to the developer leaders to make sure that that's being done right. There's also obviously an architect role for technical architects to oversee that. And then finally, last but not least, the quality assurance of a project is really important. So they're usually the people who are creating and documenting a test plan, which is the overall strategy, what kind of testing is going to take place and when, and then documenting the test scripts, so the actual details of what tests need to be done. They'll execute those tests. So that could be manual testing as things are deployed into your quality assurance sandbox. or it could be making sure that the automated tests that they're creating are being run. And maybe you have that being triggered automatically as part of your CI/CD pipeline, or maybe it's manual. Either is obviously fine. It depends on where you're at in your journey of DevOps that we talked about last time. And QA also generally have a responsibility of guiding UAT. So there will be people from the business who need to understand what are they actually testing for their acceptance in UAT. So they need a bit of guidance on how to access the system, what to do if they come across a problem, and how that gets triaged and potentially put back into the development pipeline to be fixed up before it can be released, that kind of thing. So let's do another poll. I'm going to skip to the next one. Is there anything you'd add to the responsibilities brainstorm? Do you think I missed anything? So I'm going to come back to it so you can see everything that I put in there: the leadership, the business analysis, the change management, development, DevOps, and QA. Or just jump in and chat as well. Doesn't have to be on the slide.
What's the Slido number again?
Yeah, let me come back. 460-4680-985. Thank you. I'll come back. You can take a screenshot. Cool. All right.
The sunflower sells it.
Pardon?
The sunflower sells it.
Yeah, I do love the sunflower motif. So let's talk then about where and when all of these roles and responsibilities and people are working. So that could be two things. It could be your location and your time zone, and it could be the environments, the deployment timing, like when things are actually happening in the process of getting something from a requirement through to a delivered piece of functionality. So thinking about location and time zone, especially when we have increasingly people working remotely, and people are working in different time zones, do you have sufficient overlap, or do you have the right kind of culture of asynchronous communication to enable people who are working maybe elsewhere in the world? And is that something that matters to you? It may not be. It may be that all of your people are in the same time zone, and that's cool, something that you don't have to worry about. But I know a lot of people are starting to use teams, of developers or QA based in different countries, like, South America, India, Southeast Asia, that kind of thing. So you need to make sure that you are enabling them and they're not missing out on things that they need to know, or answers to their questions. And then location. So one of the things that we have to do sometimes when we do have some of our Philippine contingent working on a project is we need to make sure that we are respecting and responsible for the security of our clients' data. So different clients that we work with might have different rules about data sovereignty. And by that, I mean, does the data ever leave the shores of Australia? And is that okay? There can be data that's considered like classified or highly sensitive, and it may, under like legislation or regulations for an industry, it may not be allowed to go offshore. That's okay if you are working, in a Salesforce org and your data is hosted in a Hyperforce server, AWS server, that kind of thing, in Australian shores, and someone might be in the Philippines and just logging into that org and doing build. But do they need to do data migration? And is that okay for them to have files that are stored maybe locally on their machine? Or would you rather they don't do that kind of responsibility? Do they need to sign an NDA before they can? That kind of thing. So keep in mind that if people are in different locations, there may be rules that you need to follow. There's also security. So, and this is really interesting, as the kind of popularity of bring your own device is growing, and as people want to work remotely, not just working from home, but just, you know, maybe I want to travel to New Zealand and work from an Airbnb for a few weeks, or maybe I prefer working in coffee shops. Is that sufficiently secure to make sure that any important information is not going to be maybe seen by someone that it shouldn't? So you have to consider things like if someone loses their laptop, or if someone walks away to go pick up a coffee from the barista, that they haven't left their laptop unlocked. So there's all these practices that you might need to put in place, as well as potentially your mobile device management strategies to make sure that if something is compromised, you can wipe it or lock it, that kind of thing. And another really important one is the cultural differences. So if you are working with people from a different country, maybe they have a different communication style, and that's going to be important to consider when you're putting together the ways that you work as a delivery team and how you communicate with each other. I, for a while, worked at Schedulo, where they had an office in Vietnam, and I found the Vietnamese team would tend to be more likely to defer to the Australian and Kiwi people or Americans, rather than speak up with something that might be not what we wanted to hear. So it was really important for us to create a culture within the team that it was okay for people to give bad news, or to say no, and that kind of thing. So you may have to be conscious about how you do that, especially as a leader on a project. Yeah, no, this is right. Yep. And shared versus separate dev environment. So if you are all working in the same shared environment, there can be some good things about that and some bad things. Some people might prefer to work in separate environments. So I guess when I'm talking environment, I do specifically mean about Salesforce development, but it could be any kind of application. Do you have a sandbox? Do you have a scratch org or branches? And at what point do features get merged into which branch? Like, what's your branching strategy? And I know we're going to talk about branching strategies a bit more in a future session. But the idea, I guess, is do you need to share development quickly? Like, do you have developers that are working on features that have a really significant overlap? Maybe you are building a lot of functionality around cases, and so your case page layouts are going to be impacted a lot, and you want them to be kept aligned. Or maybe you're working with functionality for the same personas, and you're using the same profiles or permission sets a lot, and it's much easier to have that functionality just in the same environment. It means you have fewer environments to manage as well. So you're refreshing any data seeding, any configuration of settings or underlying data that's needed to make an environment ready to build or test in. You don't have to do it as often. But generally, I find when you have a shared environment and you're using a particular kind of branching style, which is called Git flow, basically where your features might take a longer amount of time to build. You're not merging them maybe daily. if you're merging your feature branch back into develop on like every few days or a weekly basis, you can end up with large PRs that are maybe missing dependencies. So say, for instance, you've had 3 or 4 people working on the same case page layouts, and you go to, because you've finished that work, you go to get that into the release branch because you want it to be tested, but it's missing some of the page layout is missing some of the fields that another developer has built and added. So that means your deployment between environments might fail, whether you're using like change requests or something like gearset to do that deployment, because it's going to say, hey, my page layout is expecting this field, but you haven't added it to the deployment. So that can be kind of a pain. It can also be a bit unwieldy for the people reviewing your pull request to see all of the features that are there and make sure they're all good. So that can be a con. Separate environments, they're really good if you are building distinct feature branches or you need to do a proof of concept. You want to tinker with something and see what it could look like, but you don't want to actually impact real feature development that's happening. But I don't often see this in the real world. I think because it means that there's more environments to manage, and people generally aren't at that really mature stage of their DevOps where it's quick to spin up and configure a scratch org. It's not great for working on shared features because especially coupled with irregular branch merges, you will definitely find that you don't have what you need to complete your development, and people may build the same thing twice unknowingly, which can be a bit annoying to try and untangle. So one more slide. This is the last one for today. I wanted to know what you prefer, and if there's like a clear kind of preference, if you've ever experienced using your own environments in a project, because I haven't, and I'm interested to know if that's working for you, if that's successful. 4680-985.
And we're sharing sandboxes at the moment, but I wouldn't say I prefer it.
Yeah.
I find it really problematic.
What are the things that you find difficult about it?
We haven't got a really good DevOps process in place. We're quite a small company. So I think it's coupled with that. So it's more, we don't have that version control happening now where orgs can be merged and we're getting the data from a centralised location to make sure that we've got the latest build. So we end up with sandboxes that are out of date and don't have the functionality in them that they should do, and then people tend to play around in some of the sandboxes, and while they're building, so you know how a lot of people like to build as they try and work things out. So yeah, that's what I find. But I say it's probably not about the sharing, it's about the lack of a good DevOps process.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I'm pretty notorious for building stuff while I'm solutioning. Be like, how does this work again? And I try and put Emily Test in all of the names so I can find it to delete it, but wouldn't it be better if I was in my own environment?
Yeah.
And it's also possible now to create a sandbox from another sandbox. So
I was just thinking that, yeah.
It should be easier for us to do that, right? But
yeah.
we don't.
Yeah. No. Because sometimes you want to have your current development there when you're playing with a new thing or trying to build a new thing. That might not necessarily be in a sandbox that's been created from prod.
True.
The only issues we run into with sharing a sandbox is when people are basically working in the same spots. So if someone or team's working on a app, another team's working on a different app, and they're not touching, it's not an issue.
But if they are?
If they are, then it becomes a management issue. Yep. And then you're like,
Yep.
Yeah, when you have different people working in the same flow and you get out of sync with the versions, that can be really annoying. So it's important to consider. Like I still don't know the best way to approach this, but I try and think about when we're putting together the user stories and kind of what's going to be in sprint and who's going to do what. Like, are we trying to create a bunch of really small user stories, but that mean that people are going to be working in parallel on the same thing? And is that a good idea?
Yeah.
so this is slightly off topic, but it is sort of on topic. I was at a presentation at a conference last month, and some guy was professing how he is the greatest flow person ever. And he showed a slide, and it showed Rev 51.
Mm-hmm.
I scratched my head. I said, anybody that takes 50 revs to get it right is not an expert.
Like version 51?
Yep.
I mean, yeah, maybe.
So, the reason why, being an old guy, we do things backwards. We'll sketch everything out first and code last. And if you do that, shared sandboxes aren't an issue. You may take 2-3 versions of a flow and it's done. And then it's just iterations. Oh, well, the user changed their mind.
Yes, that happens.
Yes.
Haley's mentioned that she's trying to adopt package-based development, but learning
Yes.
to manage Scratch orgs is giving her quite the time.
Yeah, I definitely don't consider myself at all a developer. I'm kind of like an admin developer or an architect developer or whatever we're calling that. I dabble and cause problems for real developers. And I find the whole concept of package-based development incredibly alluring in terms of having so much less of a burden for problems exactly like this. But yeah, I'm still kind of learning how to spin up the right org and when's the right time for a Scratch org and managing all that. It's very developer-y.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Different brain that you're using.
I feel the mix. I feel a hybrid approach works for me. What I feel is we need sandboxes as well as we need CI/CDs, and I think we need multi-tiered sandboxes almost for every project. We need like a dev and a QA and a SIT or a UAT environment. I feel overlaying my branching strategy on top of my sandbox strategy probably works for me, where we have multiple or we have one or more shared dev environments, and then eventually everybody checks in their code into the Git repository, go through the PR process, and then create a higher version of the branch which is reviewed and approved, and deploy that higher version to a higher sandbox. For example, multiple dev or a dev branch goes into a test branch, and that test branch is then deployed to a QA sandbox, and then eventually it's a shared QA sandbox. But everything going into that sandbox needs to be really structured. It needs to go through the dev into the CI/CD, needs to be reviewed, approved, and merged with the higher branch, and then eventually goes through the QA sandbox, and then over from there just continuing the same process from QA to UAT, and then eventually having a final release branch which is then merged with the master is a production deployment. So I feel a hybrid works for me.
Absolutely agree. Once you get to the testing, the different, I guess, test strategies that you're doing, they must be shared environments for systems integration testing, for QA, for UAT, that kind of thing. And yeah, definitely, Vijay, come along to our session. We are going to talk about branching and environment management. But all the development is happening in an initial place, right? There's never development happening directly in your set or your QA or your UAT environment. it always is coming from some sort of feature or development based sandbox or scratch org.
Yes, a lower org essentially.
Yeah. Cool. Let's talk about the how. So, what are ways of working? Like I said earlier, I think it's a really good idea to get together at the outset of a project. You know, you may have people working on your requirements gathering and putting together the initial solution. Sometimes people call that the discovery and design phase of a project. Sometimes it's called plan and architecture. There are a few different names. But I think this needs to be a part of it. So talk together about what is your definition of ready, your definition of done, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But also talk about how you interact with each other, like the tools you have, which ones you're going to use for what, when it's a particular time of day, what meetings you have. So when do you have stand-up? And does that work for everyone in your team? Are you going to have a stand-up when everyone can attend? And if you have like quite disparate time zones, does that mean that some people are doing stand-up at the end of the day and some are doing it at the start? Does that work for everyone? Or do you need to have like asynchronous stand-ups, which are a thing? When you have questions about a particular feature that you're building as a developer, how do you ask questions about them? Is it in Slack? Is it in the Jira comments? Do you need to use email when you're including people who are maybe not in those environments, like business stakeholders? What are your team processes? So this is when you map out what is your kind of environment and branching and release management strategy. How's the DevOps going to work? But those processes could also be more about things like how do you let people know that you are on daycare pickup or school pickup and you're not going to be available, but you're going to be working later in the day. Do people need to know that, or do we just assume unavailability, that kind of thing? And also then really important is deciding who's going to do what in the team. I've talked about all the different roles and responsibilities, but also that they could be very much blended between people. You may have a smaller project and only a handful of people who need to be cross-functional. Maybe you're an architect who also needs to be doing the project management, or maybe you're a developer who is also going to be doing QA for some of the features. So make sure you decide who's going to do what and check out for any gaps. If there's no one managing DevOps, that's probably not going to be great for your project. So make sure that someone's got responsibility. And then after all, it's up to the project leadership to make sure that you have the adequate people and skill set on the team. So you can call out really early on, hang on, we've noticed we don't have anyone who can manage our environments, and we need someone. The definitions of ready and done. So this is kind of like an agile thing, but the definitions are what your team decide them to be. I've got a couple of examples of what a definition of ready or a definition of done might be, but you should be deciding this and agreeing this together. So something might be ready for build when the user story is defined and it's a good size, it's independent of the other user stories, it's relatively small. The acceptance criteria are fully written and they're testable. So you've got information like what personas, what do they need, you know, the given, when, then kind of structure, and that they're signed off by the right people. So do you have a product owner and are they okay with the requirements in that they think that they represent the true and full requirements? Is the solution accepted and is it kind of signed off and ready to be built? And then the definition of done, there's lots of different types of done. And it will depend on a little bit the structure of your project, what you consider to be done. So all acceptance criteria being passed is a good measure, but by whom? Is it that the QA team have passed the acceptance criteria and you have a definition that once it's in UAT, that's managed by the business and we consider it done? Or does it need to be signed off by the business in UAT before it's considered done? Or does it need to be deployed into production before it's considered done? And what does it mean for things that make it to UAT and get signed off but don't get deployed for whatever reason? Things like is build in source control whenever it can be. So has the PR been raised? Maybe it needs to be deployed manually. So alternatively, any of those pre or post deployment steps are documented. The build is documented in whatever way you've decided as a team you want to document it. Anything else, really? That's the beauty of doing this together as a team, is that you get to decide what it is and then you can hold one another to account. So developers can say to an architect, this story isn't ready. Why did you assign it to me? I can't accept it into sprints. And QA or release managers can say, this isn't complete. You haven't documented the pre and post deployment steps, or you haven't pulled it into source. So how are we going to deploy this? So it helps to make sure we're being responsible to one another. And how do you get team buy-in to all of this? Your team need to be the ones who are making these calls. So develop this ways of working and these definitions with them. They're the ones who are going to be doing it. In Agile, there's this concept of self-organizing teams, and this is kind of the definition of it. You have a bunch of people and you let them get together and decide how they're going to do stuff. And they are the ones that get to say how it's done. I think it's good to set your team values as well. And by that, I mean things like we get stuck in and help each other whenever we can, or we are fearless about giving each other constructive feedback. We are kind to each other. So if someone is struggling to complete something, we give them grace to do that. It's not about, you're not meeting the deadline. Come on, you need to do this, that kind of thing. So decide as a team what values you're going to have. That's really going to help them buy into the whole process when they see that those values are respected and enforced is the wrong word, but do you know what I mean? Upheld maybe by leadership on the project team. And make sure you're talking regularly. So check in on how things are going. Agile frameworks usually have like a sprint review where you go back and you talk about what worked, what didn't work, and make sure that if something needs to change, you change it. You need to make sure that you keep your people happy and engaged so that they can do the best work that they can do. So that's the delivery team session. Thanks everyone for coming again. Are there any questions that anyone has?
This isn't so much a question, but just an interesting connection. On the side, when you were talking about like setting up your agreements around timelines and roles and communications and simple things like, are you out of office for child drop-off then? I saw a really good presentation at Midwest Dreamin' from a gal who's a business analyst, and she creates a matrix for communication for all of her projects. And in the matrix is each of the communications modes, like so Slack, email, Google Drive, whatever, what it's used for, and what the turnaround time expectation is. And I really thought that was just so smart. And I started adopting that, and I use it now as part of my like base kickoff call as we build out that matrix and everybody comes to that agreement. And it has really just having the conversation around Slack is asynchronous and I don't expect you to answer me instantaneously has taken so much stress out of out of a lot of my projects.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. If you find that matrix or want to share something like on Twitter or whatever, that would be really cool. I'd love to see that.
I think I did screenshot it, so I'll dig it up and see if I can share it.
I've seen a couple of things lately about communicating with each other, how you work, especially how you work remotely. So Derek Laney, he's a Australian-based product manager for Slack. He published one on LinkedIn, and I copied it. I thought it was very cool. It's like, how do I like to work? Things like how I manage my calendar. So I love to block out focus time, but then people look at my calendar to try and book a meeting and they're like, oh my God, you're too busy. I can't give you this work. I'm like, oh no, it's okay. I just like to screen my meetings. So come ask me. And that doesn't mean that I'm not necessarily available. Sometimes things are flexible, but it helps me remember what I'm going to do. And other people sometimes don't do that. Someone else on Twitter, I loved this, said that as a tech lead, they like to build like D&D sheets about all of their team members as if they're characters. So you talk to your people and you find out, how do they like to work? How do they like to communicate? And then you can use that, you know, when you're thinking about, okay, we need to do a team meeting. This person hates doing team meetings first thing in the morning, so let's schedule it in the afternoon, and then you're going to get the best out of your people, which is very cool. All right. Thanks everyone for coming. We are not publishing a new registration just yet because I know a bunch of people are going to be at Dreamforce. There's an architect guide to Dreamforce if you're going, which I've linked, that the Salesforce architect team have shared. I know Vicky from our team is going, so you might see her at the Architect Vista. And our next session is going to be on governance, center of excellence, and monitoring. It'll be like early to mid-October, but we'll just wait for kind of people to come and cool off from Dreamforce. So that will be a good one to talk about that kind of higher level and surrounding structure of the delivery team.
And if you are going to Dreamforce, come and find me. I'll be around the Architect Vista on the 21st. I've got 2 sessions there on engaging development. So yeah, come find me.
Awesome. Thanks everyone. Bye.
See ya.
Thanks again.